Big question. First, on the question of the domestic atmosphere and the freedom of expression in Western societies. I lived through, as a child, the McCarthy era in the United States. I saw its aftermath because when I joined the diplomatic service, because I was working on China, which was a major focus of the insanity, basically. But this is worse than anything that we've seen. I do recall a moment during the Cold War when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner, when there was a similar emotional frenzy, anti-Russian sentiment. But this, I think we've achieved a new level of irrationality and emotion, and restrictions on free discussion.
Hello, I'm Pascal from Neutrality Studies. Today I'm joined by former US Ambassador Chas Freeman. He's another man who is hard to introduce because of his impressive personal journey. Just a few of the highlights include that he served as US Assistant Secretary of Defense from 1993 to 94. He served as US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia from 89 to 92, handling the fallout of the Gulf War. He was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs during the historic US mediation of Namibian independence. And he was Richard Nixons' principal interpreter during the 1972 visit to China, which led to the normalization of US-Chinese relations. A remarkable feature of Ambassador Freeman's career is the diversity of his experience. He served in Taiwan, China, Africa, and the Middle East, speaking fluently not only French and Spanish, but also Chinese and Arabic. He's also a scholar. He holds a doctorate of jurisprudence from Harvard University and wrote several books on US diplomacy and foreign policy. And I want to stress in particular that Ambassador Freeman was one of the diplomats and public intellectuals in the US who spoke out openly against the invasion of Iraq. Together with Ambassador Jack Matlock, who spoke on this channel 2 months ago, he published letters and calls against the war back when it happened. I have to stop here already to give enough time for the interview, but thank you very much, Ambassador Matlock, for taking the time.
Oh, well, thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Ambassador, I would like to talk to you today about Eurasia, the whole continent, and hear your reflections on what is currently happening in Europe and how you see that impacting Asian affairs, particularly the relationship between Taiwan and China. But let's start with the elephant in the room, and that's of course Ukraine. So Ambassador Matlock pointed out to me in an email that the war, despite its illegality under international law, is what many people in the West, realists and diplomats, have been predicting for years. And you know that there was a problem created when NATO membership was promised to Ukraine back in 2008. Do you agree with that? And how do you interpret what is currently happening in and around Ukraine? So who is to blame for the current situation?
Well, I'm not myself much into assigning blame for anything. Things happen. Usually they happen because of a combination of reasons and different motivations on the part of countries. But in this case, I think from the outset, it was very clear that membership for NATO and for Ukraine in NATO would be a provocation to the Russians. How serious their reaction would be, nobody knew. But way back when, after the end of the Cold War, when we formulated the Partnership for Peace, which was intended to be a cooperative security system for Europe, we assumed that Ukraine would want to become militarily interoperable with the rest of Western Europe, but that it would not want to join NATO, and because it would realize this was a provocation. And instead, I think the hope was that Ukraine would become both a bridge and a buffer between Russia and the rest of Europe. But, we knew that anything else would be a provocation. Now what Mr. Putin has done is worse than a crime, it's a blunder. He started off with a campaign of what looked like classic coercive diplomacy, massing troops on the border of Ukraine, but simultaneously assuring everyone that he had no intention of invading Ukraine and asking for a negotiation on European security architecture. When he was repeatedly rebuffed, his concerns dismissed, and various statements were made that made it clear that his concerns weren't even understood in the United States, at least. He apparently, on the spur of the moment, made a decision to go ahead with an invasion of Ukraine. I say apparently on the sphere of the spur of the moment, because it's quite clear he did not tell his own generals that was his intention. His troops were not briefed or prepared for such an invasion. The logistical support necessary for such an invasion, rather than exercises on the Ukraine border, was not put in place. And the performance of the Russian forces in Ukraine has not been exemplary. In fact, one of the consequences of this blunder has been to discredit the capability of the Russian forces, to devalue them as a threat. And I think, all of this has come down now apparently to a contest for the Donbass and the coast of the Black Sea, perhaps including Odessa. And the question has to be asked, is what all of the consequences of this are worth it? In many ways, as in terms of American history, what Putin has done is very similar to what President Polk did in 1848 when he provoked a war with Mexico. He basically put US troops on Mexican territory. When they were fired upon, he declared that they had been attacked and went to war. And just like the Mexican War in the United States, this was very unpopular. I think, there's a question in my mind about whether Mr. Putin, by doing what he's done, has not, in effect, replicated the blunder of Tsar Nicholas II in going to war against Japan. The same factors, underestimating the enemy, suffering a serious setback to Russian prestige. And in that case, that began the unraveling of the Tsarist system in Russia and led ultimately to the 1917 October Revolution. In any rate, that's just Ukraine and its immediate effects. But the longer term effects are much, much greater than the short term effects that we're reading about in the press and hearing about from our political leaders.
What are the long-term effects that you're seeing? I mean, on the one hand, one thing that has already started to move is definitely the getting together of Western allies, including Finland and Sweden, who are now officially contemplating joining NATO, which is, in my view, something that would only make the conflict between NATO and Russia worse. But what do you see and how do you interpret that?
Well, I think first of all, we have to recognize that what has been a long peace in Europe has ended. And as you suggested when you mentioned Finland and Sweden, but I would also mention Austria and Switzerland, which are officially neutral but have nonetheless aided Ukraine's defense. I think when you look at this, you realize that the entire alignment, the structure of Europe, is in a state of disarray. Germany is rearming. For the last 70-some years, Germany has been very diffident, very reluctant to assert itself because of its awareness of the mistakes it made in the first half of the 20th century. Now it's back as a much larger weight in global and European affairs. Exactly how the Germans will conduct themselves, no one knows. But there's about to be an election in France where one of the issues is the alignment of the right-wing candidate, Marine Le Pen, with Russia and her own doubts about NATO. So France itself may be about to join Britain in some sort of drift away from relevance to European affairs. There is more talk about European defense buildup, and that not just Germany, but others as well, about perhaps cooperative institutions for defense other than NATO. But if history is any guide, one can't count on any of these things really happening. Nonetheless, as I said at the outset, the end of the peace in Europe is upon us. And I think we're going to see Europe now divided with a sort of ceasefire line rather than any kind of peace for reasons that I will be happy to discuss. I don't think that the belated American explanation by Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, of the rationale for what is happening is very persuasive. He has stated now, finally, this is a month and a half after everything has been, almost 2 months after this war began, finally, he has stated an American policy objective, which is a free and independent Ukraine, a weakened and isolated Russia, and a stronger, more unified, more determined West. These are what he hopes to get out of this. But this is a reaction, not a strategy. And it will create permanent tensions and confrontations in Europe of a sort we really haven't seen since the 1950s. I suspect that the Russo-Ukrainian War is going to end up like the Israeli-Palestinian or India-Pakistan contests, meaning it's going to be around for many decades. It's not going to be resolved. And even if it were, peace between Ukraine and Russia would not restore peace between Washington and Moscow. I think there's a lot of ironies here. Going back to Finland and Sweden, for example, the US promoted the expansion of NATO in the expectation that it would never have to meet its defense commitment, because it was not realistic to expect that any of the new members of NATO would be attacked. Normally, when you construct an alliance, a defense alliance, you want the new members to be able to contribute, not just consume, security services. But I ask you, I don't want to pick on any of the new members, but can Montenegro, can North Macedonia contribute anything significant? Are the Baltic states, admirable as they are, able to contribute anything, or are they basically seeking protection without being able to add much to the equation. So we're coming down to a situation where there will be a direct confrontation between Russia and the West, with no buffer states, no neutral states, to prevent this from exploding. And finally, I don't know that we should count on the allied unity that there has been recently lasting very long. You can already see many countries squirming as they realize the costs to themselves and their economy from this. Will they stick with it? Will the United States and they see eye to eye, 6 months from now? I'm not sure. I guess the last consequence from the American point of view is the US had wanted to pivot to Asia. That's now been quite complicated by a need to pivot back to Europe and indeed to establish additional military presence, apparently in Eastern Europe. And so, so these are sort of military, geostrategic consequences, but there are a lot of other consequences, economic consequences, for example. And there are many lessons that will be learned from what is happening militarily in Ukraine, which we haven't discussed. This is a big, big deal.
I agree with you. It is huge. And unfortunately, at the moment, I don't see a way to de-escalate it. The buildup of this conflict, the big conflict, which like NATO even denied and said NATO is no threat to Russia. Russia is not, should not perceive NATO as a threat, which I think is a rationale that doesn't really fly, because it's Russia who decides who it perceives as a threat. But there is this idea, especially now in this very, very heated propagandized environment that we are in, that the West is that NATO is a purely defensive alliance, and this is a war of defense, and Ukraine needs to be supported. And you said something on a different channel, which is that NATO at the moment is willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. And this phrase was picked up even by Noam Chomsky, and he is now receiving some backlash on social media for not unconditionally supporting military support for Ukraine. I think it is very important what you said there, and this view that Ukraine itself, we've got a war going on between Ukraine and Russia, but we've got a conflict between Washington and Moscow, and that Ukraine in the end is more of a proxy war for the larger conflict. Do you agree with that, or do you see it differently, and what do you want to explain your comment that you made?
In essence, this is a war over spheres of influence. In 2008, when George W. Bush insisted on putting the membership in NATO of Ukraine on the agenda, over the objections, I might say, of some Europeans, he essentially proclaimed Ukraine was a de facto American sphere of influence, NATO being the instrument of the American sphere of influence in Europe, and that sphere of influence would in due course be formalized by incorporating Ukraine into NATO. That was, I think, what really alarmed the Russians. And I think, without at all agreeing with what Mr. Putin finally did, invading Ukraine, which, as I said, was both a crime and a blunder, I think it's entirely possible to understand what motivated him to make that tragic decision. Again, in terms of American history, I mentioned Mexico, during our Civil War, most people don't remember, but France installed Maximilian of Austria as the Emperor of Mexico. So what happened? That was in 1864. In 1865, when our war was over, we put 40,000 US troops on the border with Mexico and told the French that if Maximilian was not removed and their troops were not removed, we were going to invade. The French removed their troops. Poor Maximilian, 2 years later, was captured by the famous Mexican liberal Benito Juarez and was executed. During the Cold War, when Cuba, which had been very much part of an American sphere of influence under the Monroe Doctrine, defected to the Soviet Union, the American reaction was extreme and violent. Invasion, military confrontation, an embargo which continues to this very day. We also see current confrontation with Venezuela. Again, a sphere of influence issue, if you will. So I think for Russia, Russia began, if I understand what they did, not really trying to incorporate Ukraine into their sphere of influence, but trying to deny it to the United States. That was the opening position. When they invaded it, however, they asserted a more far-reaching objective, which was to subjugate Ukraine and bring it within their sphere of influence. So what had been a passive policy suddenly became an active one. Now, I think the most interesting thing about this, tragic thing perhaps, is the striking absence of diplomacy, as opposed to reliance on various coercive measures, whether they're military, economic, political, and so forth. And none of the measures that we have adopted are tied to any war termination strategy or an end game or effort to promote negotiations. On the contrary, we now hear, as Mr. Sullivan said, that the objective is a weakened and isolated Russia. I think we should be worrying about, in the short term, we should be worrying about what is being done to Ukraine and the Ukrainians. But in the long term, we have to worry about European security. If we focus on punishing and humiliating Russia while minimizing domestic pain in the United States and basically asking our allies to accept pain while we don't, I don't think this is a viable strategy. So the question of whether the United States, in fact, at the moment, has any concern about the long-term effects of this really bothers me. I don't see any evidence there's any thinking about that. And I guess I'd close my answer to your question by saying that in terms of European history, as I understand it, Europe has really only been at peace and stable when it has had an inclusive system that involved all of the great powers with the capacity to overthrow the peace. That was the case after the Napoleonic Wars, the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe, which kept the peace more or less in Europe, with a few exceptions, but minor, for a century, from 1815 to 1914. The big mistake that was made after World War I was excluding Germany and allowing the newly established Soviet Union to be excluded, which it really wanted to do as well. And the result of not having these two great powers part of the system, part of the governance of Europe, was World War II and the Cold War. And I think we're making exactly the same mistake, trying to isolate, punish a great power. I don't want to appear to endorse what Mr. Putin has done. Quite the contrary. But I'm trying to think about, where this ends up, how this ends, what it produces. And if it produces a constant threat of war on heavily armed borders between the West and Russia, I think everybody loses.
I agree with you. We have one problem, which is that what we are doing in this interview, and also what Noam Chomsky engaged in, and Ambassador Jack Matlock and Steve Wald, it's basically we have a academically quote unquote realist perception of what is happening. And I think you're explaining this quite well, how you liken the current affairs with issues that happened in the 19th century. And I personally also think that what the politics that's currently unfolding is more like the 19th century than like the Cold War, because it kind of lacks the ideological underpinning of the Cold War. But the reply that then comes from the other side of our own societies is that, no, you're misunderstanding the situation. This is the Russian war of aggression because Russia hates democracy and hates liberalism, and therefore it wants to dominate. And the US and Europe do not want spheres of influence. They are peace-loving and freedom-loving countries, and therefore we have bad anti-democratic tendencies against good pro-democratic tendencies, and they view it more as a Cold War type clash of ideologies. How can we make sense of this, that our interpretations, even at home, are so split?
Well, there's a terrible irony, of course, in asserting that this is a contest, and the contest with China also is a contest between democracies and autocracies. The first thing I'll say is that clearly there is a league of democracies that are trying to promote the installation of democracy elsewhere. I don't see a league of autocracies. I have met many autocrats over the years. They've never been concerned about other autocrats or thought they had anything in common with them at all. Their own concern is to remain in power and derive the benefits to themselves and their families that comes from that. So if you want to argue that the world is divided between this great struggle between democracies and autocracies, you will find it very difficult to explain why the great part of the global South, all of the global South, has decided to sit out this proxy war in Ukraine. In other words, the division in the world is not between democracies and autocracies. It's between former imperialist powers and those who were humiliated by them. So this is why China, India, Brazil, all of Africa, the Middle East, all of Latin America, basically, whether they condemn Russia's aggression or not, do not want to get caught in the middle between what they see as a struggle between Europeans. They have, I'm sorry to say, they look at what Europeans are doing to each other with a measure of schadenfreude. This is, these are the people who beat us up, and now they're beating up each other. Are we supposed to be concerned about that? Anyway, that is, I'm sorry to say, I don't approve of that attitude, but it is very much there, and it is expressed constantly in public fora like the UN General Assembly, and this is why you get 184 votes condemning the American embargo, or you get 176 votes condemning Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, and so forth and so on. So I think you can explain away all those things if you want, but really to assert that this is somehow part of some great ideological divide doesn't work, because when you look at what's actually happening, it doesn't conform. But there is an ideological element to this, and that is populism. And populism, which is expressed Trumpism in the United States, maybe Boris Johnson in Britain, Marine Le Pen in France, even Macron, who's just done away with the École Nationale, for civil servants, and abolished the professional diplomatic corps. This is quite remarkable. I suppose Cardinal Richelieu must be turning in his grave. But we have a problem. This war is the most intense information war that anyone's ever seen. It is absolutely impossible to know the truth. Europe has banned all of the Russian outlets. The United States has basically done the same, but not legally. We've expelled them or made them difficult to see. And of course, we began this proxy war on our side by using intelligence as propaganda. So why should anybody believe our intelligence if it's basically being put out there for political effect? And the Russians have come up with a couple of ridiculous lines that they use, which have no credibility. But the net result of this, and you alluded to this in the case of Noam Chomsky or others, is that it's simply politically unacceptable not to denounce Russia at high volume. And there is no possibility in the current atmosphere of having a dispassionate discussion of the issues that are going to determine our future. It's simply taboo. Anyone who has opinions that have some resonance, let alone coincidence with Russian views, is immediately vilified and ruled out of order in the public discussion. So we have in effect on the Western side pretty much what we have on the Russian side. That is an information blackout, all kinds of propaganda directed at domestic audiences, not allowing those domestic audiences to hear the other side, which is quite contrary to democratic theory. Supposedly antagonistic views openly expressed help you find the truth. But there is no truth, there's no effort to find it. And there can be no discussion of the implications of everything that's going on, because the popular temperament is full of fever. So here we are. And quite aside from the military and geopolitical consequences for European security and so forth, as I mentioned, there are huge economic impacts as well, piled on the earlier American-initiated trade war with China, the destruction of supply chains, the disruption of the energy markets, the disruption of markets for certain kinds of rare earths and minerals that are even nickel, which are essential for modern technology. Russia's been deglobalized. One consequence of that, by the way, is that Russia now has no alternative to dependence on China and India. So we have split the world in a way that is, of course, damaging to Russia, or maybe they split the world when they invaded Ukraine, but we are going along with it, and it's very much to our disadvantage. It's not to our advantage to have the world split in this way. And we're seeing the effects of this. The early effects are things like bread shortages in Arab countries, spreading shortages of fertilizer in other grain producing areas, given the importance of Russian and Ukrainian fertilizer production. And, we're seeing an intensification of discussion of dethroning the dollar as the method of trade settlement for commodities, and maybe as a reserve currency too, although the two are quite different. And we're seeing huge inflation, which is causing distress and unrest, political upheavals everywhere. So I think, much as we need to offer whatever help we can to the Ukrainians, we're not offering any kind of help that serves our long-term interests or helps the Ukrainians find a new balance of relationships with their larger neighbor.
I have a follow-up question for this, since I have been around for 36 years. You have seen along a stretch, you have personally experienced the Cold War. Do you remember a time in your personal experience where you thought that, okay, society is as thoroughly propagandized at home and abroad as it is now, or are we at a peak of also your experience? And secondly, this channel is called Neutrality Studies because there's a group of people who believe that neutral countries, or those who stay out of conflict, not just the classic ones, not just the Switzerlands and the Austrias, but also countries like, let's say, for example, China at the moment, which at the moment try not to get sucked into either side, or India, that try to remain at a distance from the conflict. Do you think that there's a potential that these disinterested powers could ameliorate the situation, or is that just wishful thinking?
Big question. First, on the question of the domestic atmosphere and the freedom of expression in Western societies, I lived through, as a child, the McCarthy era in the United States. I saw its aftermath because when I joined the diplomatic service, because I was working on China, which was a major focus of the insanity, basically. But this is worse than anything that we've seen. I do recall a moment during the Cold War when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner, when there was a similar emotional frenzy, anti-Russian sentiment. But this, I think we've achieved a new level of irrationality and emotion, and restrictions on free discussion. One of the things that people have speculated about, to go to your second question, is that China might be a mediator, because it has obviously got a good relationship with Russia, been very careful to cultivate one. That wasn't always the case. I remember when the Cold War ended, asking people in the Chinese establishment, what is your Russia policy? And being told that, well, Russia is going down, and this is the mid-90s, and it probably won't be coming back for another decade, but it will come back. And when it does, we want to have a good relationship with it. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure that that's the case. And that is, in fact, what the Chinese did. They have a big interest in a cordial and cooperative relationship with their neighbor, with the thousands of kilometers of border that they share. And the economies in many ways are complementary, given Russian natural resources and Chinese industry. Yes, they are, engaged with the Russians. They also, at least in their own behavior, this is an important point. I mean, the Chinese have not been global policemen. They have not been enforcers of global norms. The United States has asserted a right to do that. The Russians at one point did the same. But China has not done that. But they have insisted on the values of Westphalianism for their own behavior. That is, respect for sovereign equality of states, which is a very peculiar European notion that was imported to China in the early 20th century. Territorial integrity and non-interference in internal affairs. These are canons of Chinese diplomatic behavior. So they have a continuing connection to Ukraine and a dialogue with the Ukrainians, notwithstanding their good relationship with Russia. That, unfortunately, makes them almost unique. India has some of the same attributes, but it's much more closely aligned historically with Russia and much less interested in Ukraine. Now, the odd thing that's happened, I mean, there's so many things happening here that it's really hard to do justice to them. This is the end of the post-Cold War period. It's also the end of the post-World War II and Bretton Woods periods. It's also the end of European dominance of the globe. Now the global south is coming up. All these things are happening at once. So it's the end of peace in Europe, as I said. It's the resurrection of fights over spheres of influence that perhaps we thought we had put behind us. It's a rearrangement of great power politics, not just Germany rearming, but now Japan as well. This is really something. Could the neutral states, as you described them, I would say non-aligned, those states that emerged with independent foreign policies rather than foreign policies aligned with the bipolar order that we just left, can they play a positive role? Yes, I think they can. But it's very hard for them to do so when the level of animosity between Russia and the United States is at the level it is. We're not even talking to the Russians for the most part. So, and clearly, if our objective is a weakened and isolated Russia, that's going to be the future. So what scope is there for others in this picture? Now, there are, as I said, one of the most peculiar things is, one of the big changes is that this marks the end of Russia's 3-century-long drive to integrate itself in Europe. That's failed. No more. Same is true of Turkey, which has made a similar effort to assimilate itself into Europe and has now abandoned the effort. And I find it very interesting that the Turks have been the only people to come forward as facilitators of dialogue, not mediators, but facilitators of dialogue, because of their interest in the Black Sea and because of their relationships, neither of which is terribly good with both Ukraine and Russia. They've actually been supplying weapons to Ukraine, of course, very effective drones. And this raises another question. When the United States became involved in the war in Vietnam, after a while, the continued flow of weaponry to the enemy forces, meaning the North Vietnamese army and the South Vietnamese guerrilla force, the Viet Cong, became intolerable. We invaded Cambodia and bombed the hell out of Laos. So at what point does Russia say, Poland or Romania or whoever, your supply lines into Ukraine make you a co-belligerent, and we have the right to retaliate, and we intend to do so. So there is a possibility of a widened war. This is very early in this contest, which is why I think it's such a mistake not to be trying to find a way to compose this. Everybody, Ukrainians, Russians, Poles, Americans, Europeans generally, could benefit from an independent, democratic, uncorrupt, prosperous Ukraine.
Yes. Yes.
That is not out of the realm of possibility. But I think what's going to emerge from this war is a Ukraine that is more dictatorial and no less corrupt than it was when the war started. And that should be a matter of distress as well.
The tragedy of this situation is that it could spiral into a general European war, as you just described, and it is utterly, completely unnecessary for the well-being of everybody involved. There's just no logical way to think that anyone might come out better of this if it happened. That's why a neutral Ukraine and a stable Europe with, as you described, a stable security architecture that includes Russia would have made so much sense, but it's apparently we are spiraling the other way around. And maybe just to also like to come to an end of the interview, I want to quickly also look at China and Taiwan, because I think what's currently happening between Russia and Ukraine will have an impact on the perception of how far one can go or should go with military means. Now, unfortunately, I just got an email this morning from a student of mine who alerted me to the fact that for the first time, the Taiwanese Ministry of Mainland Affairs officially stated on Facebook that the 1992 consensus never happened and that there is no consensus around a one China policy, which is again and maybe a little step toward an escalation, which also here in Asia could lead to very dire consequences. How do you think the Russia-Ukraine issue will impact, together with how it impacts the United States by drawing it into Europe? How do you think that this will impact the equation here in Asia?
Well, actually the Democratic Progressive Party, the Kuomintang in Taiwan, has always rejected the 1992 consensus, so that's not really new. But it is a harbinger of a trend which has led most people in China to question whether there is any possibility of a peaceful settlement of this issue, of Taiwan's relationship with the rest of China. And if there is no possibility of peaceful settlement, that means the settlement has to be by violence. And so this has become the focus of the Chinese military. I think in reference to the Ukraine issue, you can say a number of things about China. First, I think they're less pro-Russian than they are now anti-American, for many of the same reasons that the Russians snapped. And that is that from their point of view, from the Chinese point of view, Taiwan is in an American sphere of influence and it's on their territory. And the two revolutions that took place in the 20th century in China both had as their central objective the removal of foreign spheres of influence from Chinese territory, the elimination of warlords, meaning local authorities who defy the center, and the reunification of China under a single authority. The Chinese Civil War has not ended. It was suspended by American intervention in June 1950 after Kim Il-sung tried to unify Korea by force. The idea was to limit the spread of the war. It did do that, but it also created a long-term situation There was artillery fire being exchanged, admittedly on a mostly symbolic level, right up to the end of 1978. 1979, the normalization with the United States brought an end to that and led China to adopt a policy of striving for peaceful resolution of its differences with Taiwan. Taiwan basically is rejecting that. That's very dangerous. Anyway, I think China is now bolted onto Russia. It's actively hostile to the United States, as indeed the United States is actively hostile to it. And, you know, the effects of this go beyond Asia. China had a little bloc of European powers, the 16+1 in Eastern Europe, who were, you know, sort of odd men out in the European Union and accepting of Chinese influence. I think now there's basically only Serbia, which is, and possibly Hungary under Orban. These two countries retain a cordial relationship with China. Ukraine has a lot of military lessons for China, which you know are applicable to Taiwan. First, don't engage in a slow roll toward towards starting a war. You need to have surprise. You need to have the necessary mass to win quickly. You need to decapitate the leadership. You can bet that looking at Mr. Zelensky's brilliant performance as a propagandist, the Chinese will very early, if they decide to go to war with Taiwan, they will very early take out all the social media and the telecommunications. It would be much harder to resupply Taiwan, even if the Chinese weren't now convinced as a result of Ukraine that any operation they conduct has to be decisive and very speedy. But you know, Taiwan's an island. Ukraine has borders with sympathetic countries. Taiwan does not. I think there are also a lot of lessons on the Taiwanese side to be learned. First of all, a sort of Swiss-style territorial defense with a professional army leading an armed militia, popular militia, well-armed, well-trained, can in fact be very effective, even against a major conventional heavily armed force. Drones work. That's one of the lessons of this and the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. And of course, logistics are key, but any military man will tell you that. They have been forever. I expect we're going to see coming out of this, whatever the outcome in Ukraine and Europe is, we're going to see increased Sino-Russian military cooperation, a lot more joint weapons development, more joint activities in space, and more joint intelligence and cooperation on early warning systems for missiles. I would expect to see after this war comes to, if not an end, at least a halt. I would expect to see a reversal of some of the classic patterns of military trade between the two countries, with the Russians buying Chinese technology, which in some respects now is very advanced. In the past, it's been the other way. Drones. China has the world's largest shipbuilding industry. It seems to turn out to very well designed and equipped naval vessels at remarkable rate. Its missiles are the best in the world, there's no doubt, in terms of accuracy. And it's got a lot of radar technology that it claims, I don't know whether this is true or not, can detect stealth aircraft with no difficulty. So I think I think we're going to see an intensification of the Sino-Russian military relationship, precisely because the United States is hostile to both. That gives them an incentive to cooperate. Will the Chinese be active diplomatically? I would like to think they would. But I have to say, current Chinese diplomacy contains the wolf warrior phenomenon, which is both unattractive and very counterproductive. It wins China no points, even if China sometimes says things that maybe in the global south have some resonance. Anyway, I think we're seeing a great power realignment, which involves, of course, the United States and Russia, but also involves China and Russia, involves China and India. China went running off to India right away to see if the common desire to stay out of this Ukraine conflict would provide a basis for cooperation. The Indians will not want the Russians to get too close to China. They'll probably be driven a bit in the direction of the United States in the future as a balance. Then we have issues beyond that. There are major countries, powerful countries in Africa like Nigeria and South Africa that are very alienated from the United States at the moment. Brazil in South America is similarly on a different track. South America is split between the Pacific coast and the rest in many respects. So I think we're going to see major realignments, and probably helped by, I'm looking for the BRICS summit, which is going to take up the question of trade settlement devices. I'm looking to see something on the currency side. Of course, we already have a swap arrangement between India and Russia. We have a similar arrangement being worked out between China and Russia. There has been a lot of talk about devising some kind of international currency, which, the ruble now is basically linked to gold and energy. It's back to pre-Bretton Woods. Yeah. I don't know where this is going, but it would have a major impact on the international influence of the United States in particular.
Yeah, I think we are going back to true multipolarity, and not one that is finally economically still linked to one single hub. There is now a real multipolarity coming up, and
well, many regional plurilateral arrangements. I don't think the renminbi is going to replace the dollar, but I wouldn't be surprised to see many currencies emerge as important. Here we have there's something that has to be mentioned. The basic duty of bankers is to be fiduciaries. That is, if I accept I'm a banker, I accept your money in deposit, I cannot put my hands on it. It's yours. I have to keep it safe for you. The United States and Britain have just confiscated Iran, Iraq, Venezuela, Afghanistan, Russia's treasuries. So the question now from these countries, and any country that might develop might develop a problem with the United States is that where we want to keep our money? No, that makes us vulnerable. So what's the alternative? People aren't looking to go into the renminbi or another currency, but they're looking for a more secure alternative to the dollar. There hasn't been one, but now I think there's an effort being made to create one. And so I don't think we have any idea, we're certainly not talking about the long-term impact of this disastrous situation in Ukraine, which is a nightmare for everybody. But we really need to think about the longer term effects, and we need to regain the freedom to discuss them. No, now if you try to raise that, that somehow that's seen as a distraction.
Well, Ambassador Freeman, we are going to try, together with others, to push towards having that discussion and having it in an informed and, as you said, dispassionate manner, because I don't see a way out of this if we keep trapping ourselves in very narrow narratives, which I think is a huge danger. It's a huge danger if we try to, as you said in the beginning, put blame, etc., and then divide the world into ideologies. I hope that we can get out of this. That's why I'm also afraid for the Western side, that we are trapping, the West is trapping itself in its own story about what's going on, which is why
Well,
it's
so are the Russians.
So are the Russians. So are the Russians. We that's the horrible part. And everybody has a different analysis. And therefore, you don't have a common approach towards finding a diplomatic solution. And interestingly enough, there's people who think about it. In Taiwan, Liu Xulien, the former vice president, she is trying to create some form of a federation of the Zhonghua Federation, of saying maybe we can think about reaching a settled agreement where Taiwan is neither independent nor a province of China. But these kind of approaches automatically are then often rejected by hardliners on both sides as no, never, ever. And we see the same in Ukraine. The people who are most ardently against a diplomatic settlement are the ones on both sides that want the contest to end in their view right. Their peace should prevail, which is so sad.
Well, that's what a zero-sum game is about. And that's the game that we're all playing, and it doesn't help. So I think probably we've come to the end of our time and then some.
Yes.
I will just say that I would like to hope that there is a way to address the long-term issues. I haven't found it yet. I hope you do.
We are going to look for them. We can't give up. It's just not an option. Ambassador Freeman, I will be in touch with you, and I thank you very much for taking the time of talking to me.
Happy to do so. I hope it was useful. Bye-bye.
Very much, very much. I'll talk to you again and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.